Yeah. Yeah. Has anyone ever used particles before? nParticles?
Yeah.
It's mainly new for everybody.
We showed a bunch of stuff you can do with it, but like we were shown. Wait. Yeah. I was thinking of something else.
So something else, not nParticles.
No,
Okay.
not at least not much.
Okay. Give Maya a second to load. So particles are usually used for the most part to create, say, water or smoke or, say, sparks coming off of something that's hitting the ground. It's used for something that a lot of it gets generated at a given moment and it gets influenced by certain fields, either by gravity or by air. There's a program out there called Houdini, which I think a lot of people in the industry, a lot of people in specifically the film industry will use to create their particle simulations. They can be relatively taxing on the CPU. A game engine like Unity also uses particles. So essentially what you're learning in Maya or stuff that you can do in Maya can directly be brought over to a video game engine and understanding how their particle systems work. There's a lot of carryover between different applications and different game engines. A lot of the same principles apply. So a scene was provided. It's this nParticle rocket.ma. And I'll move it over to my project folder. I'm going to keep it in my lips to form just for simplicity. Since my project is already made, I'll set my project. Lips to form, set. nParticle rocket. Don't save. So now you have this fancy scene with this fancy rocket. I'll just go ahead and instantly save a new scene. Make sure I don't save it as an MB, always save as an MA. I'll do an underscore 1.
What's the difference between saving them as one and the other?
MA is my ASCII, MB is my binary.
Can I think mine auto saves to an MB.
Yeah. So with an MB file, it can only be read and written to in Maya. With an MA file, you can open up in ASCII or open up into like a notepad and be able to manually edit it yourself. So it's kind of an old trick, but a long time ago, if you went to Open Scene, Open Scene, file, open. They must have removed it. You can manually change the in the MA file, if it said like Maya 2013 or 2014, you can manually change the number there to be able to bring it into another Maya application. If for some reason the MA file gets corrupted, there's a potentiality of being able to open up another MA file, take a portion of the text, and be able to re-import that into the MA file and hopefully get it to load correctly. Because usually it'll start from the top, and if it hits a line at the top, then it'll stop loading completely. But sometimes that needs to be refreshed, like it's like cameras, lights, it's UI, it's Windows. So it just allows you the potentiality of being able to open up the file and make modifications to it outside of Maya. Whereas MB, it's a closed shell. You can't do anything with it other than open it up in Maya. I'm going to this rocket comes with an emitter, but I want to start from the beginning because it kind of has issues. So I'll open up the file and I'll open up my outliner and I'll just go in and I'll find this emitter 1 and I'll delete the emitter. We're going to be making our own emitter. This geometry is parented to this NURBS curve. While generally it's a pretty good location, if you were to start animating it, to me the rotation is slightly off. So I would take the geometry and I'll middle mouse drag the geometry out. And I'll get my locator, and I'm going to bring my locator down to where the, say, source of ignition or the source of power is coming from. I'll freeze transformations on that NURBS curve. NURBS circle 1 isn't named correctly, so I'll come in here and I'll rename it to Rocket Master Manip. A lot of the manipulators that I name in the scene, I usually name them underscore manip, and then joints in the scene, I name them underscore JNT. I'll take my geometry and I'll middle mouse drag it back on top of the NURBS curve, so that now it is again parented to the NURBS curve. So now if I animate my NURBS curve, it'll rotate based on the where the power is coming from. It's up to you if you want to adjust this. Me personally, I think it should be low right here, but up to you if you want to leave it right there and just see how it animates. So I'll bring my time slider. So for this exercise, and again it's kind of stated in the online saying that you can animate it however you want. You can animate it taking off, you can animate it flying, you can animate it flying toward the camera. For this instance, I will just kind of animate it flying up. So I'll set a keyframe on 1, and I want it to say pause for, say, 2 seconds. So my animation is 24 frames per second. So if I put my key at 48 frames, then that's going to be 2 seconds. At 160, I'll just randomly find a number. I'll then translate my rocket up and auto key. Is auto key on? Sure feels like it. Yeah, auto key's on. Is auto key? So I like to have auto key off. I think by default it's usually on, so that when I'm moving my manipulator, it's not automatically keying depending on where I have it in my timeline. So make sure auto key is off. I'll close my outliner. I'll go to my main camera. I'll go to my render settings. I'll go to View, Render Settings, and go to my resolution gate. Right now resolution is 960 by 540. I'll go to my render options. And this should all be relatively familiar when you guys were doing the lighting. HD 540. For this, because render times can be slightly on the larger side, start off at 640 by 480. And I'll put my camera a little on the lower side. Something like this. Let me check my focal length. Really? Oh. Select my camera, go to perf shape. I'll adjust my focal length to, say, 30. And it zooms in my camera, so I need to pull back the camera. So I'll position my camera to something around here. It's completely up to you how you want to position the camera. I'll select my camera again. I'll bring my timeline to 1 and I'll press S. So now whenever I'm moving around, manipulating things, moving stuff around, if I scrub the timeline, the camera will pop back to the position that I keyframed it at. So that is my beautiful animation. Whatever time I want to spend on it is completely up to me. If I wanted to animate the camera, if I wanted to animate this guy. But for demo purposes, I'll just leave it like this. I'll turn off the gate for now, just so I'm able to see things. If I go to the pull down up in the upper left hand corner, I have this FX pull down. There is all these end solutions, end particle, end cloth, end hair, end constraint, end cache. So the one we're going to be using is nParticles. So I'll create a emitter. And when the reason I deleted that first emitter is because when I just by default create an emitter, I'll open up my outliner again. If I default create my emitter, I get a nucleus that comes with it. A nucleus is essentially changing the environment that is manipulating that particle. So I have a lot of stuff that I can play around with. Gravity, wind are the big ones. Gravity by default is 9.8 because on Earth it's 9.8. Those are the gravity, air density, wind speed, wind direction, and wind noise are some of the things that you'll probably be adjusting. Let's see. So if I go to my timeline and play, and so I don't want it to play, I'll play it to 130. So I'll change my timelines to 130 down here, and I'll play it. You'll notice that it's emitting, but it's too low, and there's a few things that need to be done. So instead of scrubbing the timeline back, you'll notice that if I play my animation, the particles actually stay there. They don't go in reverse. They only actually just go forward. So the best thing you can do is click on go to start playback range, and that kind of resets your timeline. It also resets your particles. So when you do hit play, it shows the correct numerical values that you're putting in. So just constantly hit play, stop, and then press this button. Hit play, stop, hit this button. So first and foremost, my emitter needs to be in a different location. So if I select my emitter from the outliner here, I want it to emit, say, just below the geometry that I have right here. Now I also want it to travel with my rocket. So I'll open up my manipulator again, and I'll middle mouse drag my emitter to rocket master manip. Also rename my emitter. If I can spell. Engine emitter. So now that I have it parented to this manipulator, it'll now follow the rocket. Next part I want to do is I want my rocket to be sitting on something. So if I create a polygon primitive and a plane, I don't need this much geometry in my plane, so I'll go to my channel box and inputs and adjust my subdivision width and height. There are other areas that that you can adjust it, but that's probably the easiest, is to just come in here, select the name, shift select the next name, and middle mouse drag in the viewport to just instantly bring that down to 1:1. I'll scale this up. I think you can be extra fancy if you had a little tower next to the rocket, but being that this is your last project, there's a certain amount that I'm asking from you guys. I think the rest is just icing on the cake. So now that I have this piece of geometry here, I'll freeze transformations. There is these options in nParticles like make collide, soft body, but they tend to not necessarily work with this setup. So what you have to actually do is you have to go into nCloth. Make sure your geometry is selected. Go to nCloth and create passive collider. If I go to my attribute editor and click on my geometry now, I can see that I have an N rigid shape on there. So now when I reset my camera, I'll take away my grid just so I can see from underneath my rocket, and I'll hit play. You'll notice that my particles are shooting up and then they're resting on the ground. Why? Well, let's take a look. So the size of your scene is important. So if I select my geometry, and if I go to these collisions right here, if I go to solver display and I turn on thickness, doesn't want to change it. Oh, now it changes. It won't change it when I'm really close. So this is the thickness of the collision. So while the geometry is a thin piece of geometry, what Maya is actually doing is saying that there is a certain amount of thickness to it, when in actuality it's that thin. The reason you want thickness in your collision properties is because if it were one-to-one to, say, a plane, then there's potentiality of particles being able to pass through that collision layer and fall out from underneath. So there's a bit of a buffer zone that you need to have on all things so that they don't penetrate through or pass through the piece of geometry. So So this should dynamically change, but if it doesn't, I'll go to thickness and I'll adjust this to 0.010. I'll turn off my display and I'll turn it back on. You'll notice that the amount of thickness that I have now on this plane is a lot more thinner. It still has a bit of thickness to it. I'm not bringing it down to exactly 0 or else my particles potentially pass through. But it's thick enough to the point where it will prevent particles from passing through, but it'll look like the particles are sitting on the ground. So I don't need this yellow anymore, so I'll go to solver display and I'll just turn it back to off. My particles are going absolutely crazy. If I scrub my timeline, you'll notice that they don't work correctly. So I'll hit the playback, go back to start button, and I'll hit play. So that's actually still not thin enough. It's kind of weird that thickness. I'll make this a little smaller. I'll say 02502. Restart. So the other thing is that these particles, if I click on these particles and I go to collisions, they too have a particle thickness to them. So I will adjust my collide width scale. There we go. So I might have to adjust this more depending on the size of my particle. But just to get them a little closer to the ground, I'll just put this at 0.5 and I'll reset. So they're actually colliding with the ground now, and they're also they should be colliding with themselves to a degree. So they're not exactly on top of each other. They're all slightly next to each other. I'll turn off my collision thickness for now. Now if I go to my rocket and see how I can demonstrate this. What I'm going to do is let me think. I want to demonstrate it, but I also don't want to lose my keyframes. So if let's do this. For demo purposes, I'm just going to key it at 130, and then I'm going to bring it back to 200, 200. I'll delete my last keyframe. For my camera right now, I'll delete my keyframe off my camera, and I'll do it later, just because I want to show you guys. So if I rotate this guy and put him up here, and I'll keyframe it, you'll notice that it's a little bit of an illusion. While the rocket is going up, the particles that are coming out of it are just dropping to the ground. So I want the illusion of the particles actually being
Coming from the thing.
coming out of the rocket. So if I bring it back to the beginning, I can use these fields and solvers up here. There's a combination of fields and solvers that you can use and experiment with. Air, drag, gravity, Newton, radial, turbulence, uniform, and vortex. Air can either be uniform across the entire scene, or it can be concentrated into a volume. But air is essentially the moving of air. Drag is something like if you're underwater. Gravity, while there's gravity on the particles, some of these end cloths and end hairs require that there's gravity in the scene. Newton means that the two particles or the two items that are being physically driven are attracted to each other. Radial means that there's a push out from a single direction. Turbulence is a push out of a single direction, but in multiple unbiased directions. So if I have a cup of water and I spin the water and then put the water in there to stop it, or put a spoon in there to stop it, the water tends to become turbulent. Uniform is a uniform force, like radial, but it's concentrated in a single direction. And then vortex is like a tornado. So if I select my particles, if I select my nParticle 1 and go to my fields and solvers, I can click on a number of them. But let's try uniform first. And I have my uniform field selected. I'll bring it up into the engine. I'll parent it to the manipulator. I'll rename my uniform field. I have a magnitude setting right here, but I also have a volume. So I'll change my volume to a cylinder. Cylinder's pretty big, so I'll need to scale the cylinder down. Right now my particles might just go crazy, but let's see what happens. I'll make my magnitude more intense. Kind of works. I also want to make sure my direction is correct. Right now it looks like a boy rocket. So it's coming out of the positive x direction. So I'll change my x to 0, and I'll change my y to a -1. So remember x, y, z, RGB. It's having a little bit of trouble there. Yeah.
Can you keyframe it where, like, right before it turns, you save it, and then you move the particles to shoot out the negative direction?
I could not key it at all for now. Maybe that would help.
Yeah, and then, like, right when it turns, you change the numbers so then that the particles would shoot with the direction that would rise.
Isn't it because the field doesn't take its orientation in space into account?
It should. So let's not. Should work. Let me delete this guy. Let me bring this guy back down to Earth. I think unless you're a particle artist or someone who works in particles a lot, particles tend to be just a lot about experimentation. So let me switch it over to air. I'll select my nParticle. I'll go to my field and solvers, and I'll click on air. We'll bring it up into the engine. I'll middle mouse drag it into the manipulator. I have my air field selected. Can also turn it into a cylinder. I'll scale it down. It too has a magnitude value. It also has a direction, so this is +1. So if I do a +1, it's shooting up. I really want -1, and I'll add a little bit more magnitude to it. I'll raise my rocket, rotate. There we go. So now the particles are being projected out. I'll stop it. I'll go to my particles. I don't want my particles to last forever. So under my particle options on the right hand side under the attribute editor, I can switch it over from live forever to a random range. So if I leave it 1 and 0, you'll notice that my particles end at this point. If I reset and put 0.5, then they'll only go halfway. If I put a lifespan of random, it'll go from the lifespan of 5, but since I'm adding a 1.0 of random, some particles will die off half the way, and some other particles will die off at the full 1. Collisions I don't need anymore for now. Under shading, you can leave it on for points for as long as you want, but at a certain point you want to switch it over to cloud. I'll adjust the opacity. You guys had not?
Yeah. You can help hold on anymore. He's really sick. He's like feeling dizzy and stuff.
Okay. All right. Feel better?
Here. Bye.
All right. Take care. So I brought down the opacity so it's not completely opaque. I'll adjust my particle size so that they're a little bigger, a little easier to see. I'll go back to my emitter. And you'll notice that there are these kind of stepping. So it emits and then it stops and emits and it stops. You need to adjust my particles per second, I believe. I think there's also another number that I have to adjust. So that's a little better. So I am, for each second I'm emitting 100 particles, but being that the number originally was 1, the speed at which it emitted was not quick enough. So I'll change that to, I think originally I had to 5. But if I increase the speed, then it allows my wind force to be able to push more particles out. It has more to push. I'll go back to my particle. Two might be too big. Let's see if I can get this to work. There is this radius scale, depending on time. But I was kind of having some issues with it. So what I'm doing here is I'll change this to 5. Yeah, I'll leave that at 5 right now. What I'm saying is the radius scale, and I've clicked in this box to create 2 points. By default, it's on linear. And if it's linear, it's just a straight curve. Like this particle is instantly smaller than that particle, is instantly smaller than that particle. Whereas if I were to switch it over to smooth, there's a nice increase from small particles to large particles. I put a point down here and I put a point up here to say that the particles that I want at the start of the age are going to be small, and the particles that I have at the end of the age are going to be large. Let me adjust my, I'll go back to my emitter. See what happens if I crank this guy up. Whoa! They're emitting way too fast. It's pretty good. Can also go to, yeah.
Can you keep these so it starts, for example, it starts out slow and you can increase the speed as the rocket goes up, or can you not keep these?
I believe you can key them.
You can right click the attribute.
Set key.
Yeah.
So yeah, if you wanted to, you would just have to select this key right here and then right click on the number and set key. Most numerical values in Maya allow you to be able to set a key, be able to animate them. If I go to my emitter, could also experiment with Omni. So if I go to my emitter, there's basic emitter attributes. There's directional, omni, surface, curve, volume. Directional means it's being emitted in a certain single direction. Omni means it's being emitted from all directions. And surface means it's coming off of a selected surface. Curve, it's coming off of almost like a NURBS curve. And then volume, you would do something different, but it'd be coming out from a volume. So I'm going to go back to my airfield, decrease that guy. So for the most part, it's I think it's acting how I want it to act. Probably lower the opacity. If I select my particle, stop. Let's see. Shading, and I have opacity scale. Switch it to age. I'll bring this guy up and that guy down. So like the same thing with the size. I now have a curve for the opacity, and I've attached it to the age of the particle. So after a certain point, the particles become transparent. I think the opacity here, and I'll adjust it when I start rendering, but I think the opacity is a little too intense, so I'll bring back down the opacity of the particles. I'll reposition my rocket, reset my timeline, I'll reanimate my rocket. This. This. Okay. It was straight before, I swear. Let's see. It's interesting that it's coming off the side. Bring this down a little bit. Let me readjust my airflow. Some emitters there, a field's there. Sorry guys. It's coming out to the side. But why? I mean, we all thought it was working a second ago. Unless I accidentally put a number somewhere. So if something like this happens, the best thing you can do is limit the amount of influence that might be happening. So if I move my wind off to the side, you notice that my wind is not changing the orientation of my particle. I have a translate Y, I don't have a rotate to it. The only other thing is that I changed it to a directional, and there's a direction. There you go. Direction is X. So this direction X needs to be 0, and this needs to be -1. My particles are shooting up because the volume that I have for the particles, if I go to back to particles and go to collisions, for some reason my size got exponentially bigger. Not too sure what's up with that. Maybe I accidentally. Oh, self-collide. No, that needs to be 0.5. Let's make this collide width scale. So let's say 0.1.
Self-collide is off, so.
Oh, yeah. There we go. So I'll turn off my collision display. I'll put back my, essentially a fan. I'll rotate my rocket just to make sure things work. Not the greatest animation. The lifespan of my particles could be adjusted. Try 2. Start over. And go back to my airfield again. Adjust it so that I have it back on my particle emitter. So then my airfield is directly on my particle emitter. It's pushing the trail better. The ground has a bit of friction to it. This is kind of the tricky part because if I rotate my ground, I can get the particles to. Oh, that's what I want to do. So right now if my ground is to the side, my particles feel like they're getting pushed away. But since my ground is flat, they tend to just kind of stick there. So I want to select my particles, and I'll create a new field, and I can switch it up to either do an air, I can do a radial, or I can do a vortex. For this, I'll experiment with a radial. The default radial numbers are probably too low, but just in case, we'll play the animation. Let me raise it up from the ground. I'll put it at a high number. How about a really high number? See what happens. Whoa! Okay, maybe radial's not the best.
Did you get the same effect from making them self-collide?
I want the kind of feeling that I want is for the particles to
Yeah.
push away,
So if they self-collide, do they push them out?
and they might push onto themselves,
Oh.
but they won't like forcefully like have a force to them or movement to them. So I'll select my particles again. I'll go back to my fields. Let's try turbulence. Magnitude of 100. Not getting what I want. It's a little better. So I feel like that effect is a bit better. I could go in and change more numbers. I could go in and put more fields in to just see what they do. But let's do a render and see how that looks. Pretty good. Still think the opacity is probably a little on the stronger side, so I'll adjust that. Go back to my particle and go to shading. Change that to 1. Save an image, render it out. That's a bit better. It's not as, white. So I think the Maya software on default is on low quality. If I switch this over to production quality, I think my render significantly increase. That's not too bad. Never mind. So I switched it over to production quality and added a second. When I was doing tests, it seemed like it was adding quite a bit of time. So once I have all my particles in, once I have all my fields in, and I like how the render is going, then I'll reposition my camera like what I did in the beginning. And I want to be able to see a window, so. Take the camera low, select my camera, keyframe it. See if I can do a quick animation. So it flies up. Let's say I want it to here. And I'll delete. And then let's say put it back in the frame. Right here. Could use work. And ain't too bad. And you guys know about the animation graph editor to smooth out the curves. That's my 10-second animation. I hope you guys your guys' animations are better than mine. But you can essentially see what I'm going for. I'll render it out. So what I usually like to do is render out a few frames. So if I start it over, I'll render out the first frame, then I'll hit play, and I'll render out the next frame, then I'll hit play, and render out the next frame, play, render out next frame, play. And the lighting that we did on the previous exercise, you could also do in here to make it seem like it was a sunny day. So now that I've looked at kind of like a few key moments in my animation, if I like how it turned out, then I would set up batch render. You guys know about batch rendering? Yeah? So you guys know that if a frame, I mean, this is rendering pretty quick because there's no lights in the scene, but essentially this would render really quick. If a frame is 2 seconds, and if my scene is 200, then it's 200 times 2, and that's how long it's going to take to render. So make sure you allow enough time for your computer to sit there and render out all the frames, and then allow yourself to have enough time to open it up as an image sequence in QuickTime and then make a video. Are there any questions? So to recap, because I know it was a little bumpy, but the biggest things you have to know is the FX pull down, the nParticles pull down, the fields and solvers. If I have a piece of geometry there that I want the particles to react against, I go to nCloth and I create a passive collider on that piece of geometry. Under nParticles, I'll create an emitter. From there in the outliner, I switch between how the emitter is emitting and what the particles actually look like. I'll select my particle that I want influenced by the field, and I'll pick a field and I'll adjust it, and I'll raise up the values either high, or I'll reposition the field to another location to see how it's affecting my particles. And then I'll either leave that, say, turbulence field sitting on the ground, distorting the particles, or I'll go in and put a field on the rocket master manipulator so that it is constantly pushing the particles or disrupting the particles. I'll do a few renders in my software. I'll make sure that I have the highest quality turned on. And I think that's adjusted it. There are lots of attributes that you can come in here and adjust. Ones that I recommend you playing around with is shading. You can adjust the color of the particles. So if you wanted the illusion of fire that's illuminating the smoke, you can change the first color. You can add more colors, but you can change the first color to a warmer color, and then the second color would be a white. The color input would be age. So now when I play, the particles that are the newest are warm, and the particles that are oldest are white. So I can put a color here. I can put another color in the beginning. To make it feel like light is, really close to the particles. Or I can make the trail feel like a different color entirely by not necessarily using white. I wanted a slightly bluer trail. But I highly recommend that you spend a little bit of time just playing around with certain things. Just because I show it a certain way doesn't mean it's necessarily the tried and true way. As you can tell, when I try and show you one way, it doesn't necessarily work. There are a number of factors depending on the size of it, the magnitude, the position of it. So just really experiment and throw stuff in there and see what it does to the particles, and either see if you can use them or not use them. Delete them, put them in. Just really experiment and try and get some interesting results with the particles. That's what I got. There's no more questions. And I'll post the video up on my YouTube page, which is the link on top of the main website. All right, guys. You guys are free to stay here and work on this, or you guys are free to go. Thanks, guys. Oh, and remember, save. Have a good one.